It was just over a year ago that I first ever vocalized my desire to do this podcast to a group of my friends. And over the next sort of 6 months from that point, the artwork was made, the music was made. And then I sort of dawdled for a while and tried to make everything perfect before I really committed to it. But fast forward to May, and the first episode of the Lonely Chapter podcast goes live. And I think I got to a point where I'd thought and thought and thought so much that I just had to do it. And looking back now, just doing it um, was the key thing. And you can definitely overthink this sort of thing. I think I've really enjoyed the aspects of doing it and just learning as I go and learning where I can do better, learning what works, what doesn't. But yeah, that was a great decision to do and just start it. I committed to weekly uploads and I've stuck to that. So we're now at episode 36, which is incredible. And it's absolutely flown by. It's been a massive challenge at times trying to get that weekly episode out around other aspects of life. But it's a challenge that I've really enjoyed. And I am glad. One of my guests recently asked me if I regret doing that. Um, the answer is no. I think I'm glad I did it and it's held me accountable. And I think it's keeping me driven to have that challenge of uploading weekly. So I'm really keen to stay consistent with that and keep going in 2025. Hopefully, you're as excited as I am to see what 2025 has to offer us. Hopefully be speaking to some really interesting people and reaching out to some amazing people. So I just want to start by thanking you guys, the listeners, whether you've listened to all of the episodes, a few of the episodes, or if this is your first episode. Thank you for coming along, and hopefully you'll stay for 2025 and beyond. So, today's episode, I just wanted to reflect on a few things, but I want to start off with something that I read in James Clear's 321 newsletter the other day. So, this this really resonated with me and sort of my life over the last few months and pretty much since I've started this podcast. So the idea is you have to work hard to discover how to work smart. You won't know the best solutions until you've made nearly all of the mistakes. So that really resonated with me because I'm still very early in this podcast thing and I'm trying to work it all out. And at times, my life has felt very hectic and I've been working hard with it. I've been working hard outside of the podcast. But it reminds me that there's no way around that. You have to sort of go through that stage of, I say the word chaos, but it hasn't been utter chaos. But you have to go through that period of really hard work and sort of being pulled from one thing to the next to start to work out which bits work and which bits don't. At least that's what I think, and I'm hoping as I start to understand more what's needed of me away from just the microphone. So behind the camera, the editing, the booking of guests, the trying to get people booked in on certain days around my other life commitments is it's a lot that goes on and it's something I'm trying to work out. And as time goes by, I'm sure it will get more and more streamlined. But yeah, it was just a nice quote that I read and I thought resonated with how I've been feeling and maybe some of you guys out there as well. So I want to look back at my year outside of the podcast. So obviously, a lot of you know within the podcast what's been going on. This is 36 episodes over the last 7, 8 months. And we've spoken to some really cool people, had some really interesting, really insightful, and really important conversations. And it's taken me on journeys outside of the podcast as well, which I'm excited for. But outside of the podcast, I started this year I started the end of last year applying to be a Samaritan's listening volunteer, and I've mentioned it a few times on the podcast. But it was January this year when I started the training for that. And the training for that is 6 weeks of a weekly session in person. And then after that, you go into a mentored state on the phones. So that was March time for me. So at March, I was then on the phones taking calls, and you have someone listening in, and that goes on for another 6 or so sessions. And then beyond that, you get signed off to be solo. And again, you're sort of learning along the way, you're learning from the people around you, and then you get signed off. So for me, I got signed off in October. So started in January, went on the phones with a mentor at March, and in October, I got signed off. So that is most of this year, is something I've been committing to. And it's been really, really valuable. It's been really rewarding and eye opening to speak to people at the moments in time when they call and hopefully help them in that moment. Another thing that I've done this year, which again, a lot of people will know about, is the rock trilogy. So it sort of feels like I haven't done it, and it's almost a forgotten memory already, but I need to really like remember that I did do that. And that was pretty much my entire year. So the rock trilogy was 3 triathlons, extreme triathlons, based on each of the 3 peaks in the UK. So that was Snowdon, Scafell Pike, and Ben Nevis. And that was in May, September, and October. So around those dates, my training was from the start of 2024 through to May. From May, I was trying to maintain my fitness through to September. And then September to October, again, was just a little maintaining phase. So for 10 months or so, I've been training in one way, and that's been quite hard to do as well. But I'm enjoying taking a step back from that training for a time. But yeah, that was a really big thing that I'd set myself to do last year. So I'm glad I got it done this year. Anyone who wants to listen to the full breakdown of the Rock Trilogy, obviously episode 25 of this podcast, I reflected on that whole experience. So go and have a listen to that. I also did the Hampton Court Half Marathon for the second year in a row, and I will be going again in 2025, hopefully for a bit of a better time, but we'll see how that goes as training changes. We'll see where I'm at. I attended a number of social run meetups, which was the first year I've ever done something like that. So I know run clubs and sort of group exercise things have been massive this year and really taken off. But yeah, I went and I did a few of those runs, and that was with Omnia Performance and Fergus Crawley. I met a load of really cool people through that and got some numbers, got people to train with outside of that. So that's really cool. And I would recommend that, especially if you're someone who doesn't really have anyone who does the sports that you are interested in. Go to one of those. I've been to them like alone multiple times. Everyone will start talking to you, and you can just start talking back to them and have a conversation, find out a lot about people, and it's a really nice experience. Those are just a few things that I've covered off, but loads more has happened this year, and I've reflected on them in my own personal time, but I won't be doing them all right now. So I wanted to move on. So in my own personal reflections of the year, there was a few sort of things about what I'd learnt from the year, what actions I'm going to take going forward. So I'm going to give you a few of those. So I'm going to give you 3 lessons and 3 actions that I have sort of given myself or learnt from last year. So lesson number 1 is consistency is key. And again, this comes down to the podcast, really. That consistency of churning out a weekly episode, making sure it happens, thriving on the challenge of doing that as well. But that being the ultimate thing that brings the success eventually. And I've known that for years, obviously, through like personal training. With your fitness, consistency is key. Action number 1 is to reach out to people more often. So people in your life who maybe have moved away, are traveling, or if they're just around the corner, but you haven't really spoken to them for a long time, just trying to recontact those people every now and then. So when you're going about life, sometimes people randomly just enter your mind and you suddenly think about them, think about how long it's been, and then probably think about another problem you've got on the day and they sort of disappear. I want to start to make a conscious effort when people come into my mind like that to just send them a message and say, "Hey, just thought of you. I hope you're doing well." Something like that. And that was a little tip I learned from Chris Williamson a few years back on his podcast, and something I started to implement for a time, but I need to get back onto it because it was a really good one. And it's such a simple thing to do. So, lesson number two is people are interesting. And again, this is one that I've done to death on this podcast. But speaking to people this year has been unbelievable. Like the amount of interesting stories and stories that I didn't know were behind people who I've known for ages just reinforces the idea that everyone's got a story. People are interesting. So go out there, speak to people, and just ask some questions, ask some open ended questions, and just get talking to people. So, action number two is go to more gigs or live shows. This is something I want to do more in 2025. And I've been to a few gigs over the last few years. I went to see The Killers last year in 2023 and Sleep Token this year, 2024. Both amazing gigs. And I've been to smaller gigs as well. But the feeling I get out of gigs is, and I'm sure most people get that when they see a band that they love, they get that sort of buzz after it. And I get the same thing with like live shows, theatre shows. So I just want to make a conscious effort to sort of do that more often. And maybe that links up with the first action of reaching out to people, start to do those things together with those people. Lesson number three is don't ask, you don't get. So this is something that I've sort of learned in terms of, again, the podcast is I've reached out to people who I would almost certainly say wouldn't respond, let alone say yes. And these people have come back and said yes and been on the podcast. And it just shows that if you don't ask, you don't get. And I know that's a sort of cliche thing, but take that outside of that phrase. If you don't do an action, you're never going to get an outcome. You've got to do some form of action. You can't just sit and do nothing. If you sit and do nothing, nothing will happen. I reached out to these people and they came on my podcast, and I'm very lucky for that. So, the last action for me, so action number three, is to pre plan my weekly schedules a bit more. So, this is something that I noticed as I sort of reflected on the year again, with that sort of hectic feeling that I want to try and avoid or try and minimize a bit more, is just scheduling things a bit more ahead. So, looking at my week ahead, trying to work out where I can place things. Because I think currently I have all these things I want to do in a week, and I don't really think about when they're going to happen. And I leave them and I leave them and I leave them. And then suddenly I'm cramming loads of stuff into the end of the week. So pre plan my weekly schedules a bit more. I've had an absolute blast this year. I enjoyed reflecting on it personally as well. And I can't wait to see and do more in 2025 and for you guys to be there. So thank you again. So now I'm going to go on to some of the questions that my guests have been leaving. So at the end of episodes now, I've been asking my guests to leave a question for you, the listener, to take away and have conversations with friends, family, strangers, whoever it is. The reason I've done that is because when I was listening to podcasts, I say that like I don't listen to them anymore, but when I listened to podcasts, the thing I really enjoyed was taking them away and having conversations about the topics with people who I knew had listened to the podcast. And that's what sort of drove me to start this podcast was I liked listening to them and I liked having the conversations around the topics after the fact. So by doing it, it gave me a reason to have more of those conversations. So there's a little insight into why I started. So I think I've got about 6 questions from the last 8 or so episodes that I've done. And these are the questions that the guest has left for you, but I'm going to answer them. So, number one was from episode 27 with Georgie Barber. His question was very simple. It was, what's next? So, I love this question. Just 2 words, but so much power and so many ways you can think about that. It's not just a literal what's next. So, I'm in the studio now and then I'll drive somewhere after. Like, it's not about that. What's next? I'll take this in terms of the podcast, I suppose. As I've spoken about quite a lot, consistency is something that I've really prided myself on this year, and it's something I want to continue to carry forward into next year. Keeping the consistency up, not really worrying too much about the views or the likes. They fluctuate so much. So by focusing on those, I think it's very easy to get disheartened. And I guess that's where most podcasters probably fall off is they get too involved in those. They might have a really good week with an interesting guest that really took off, and then next week maybe not as many people are as interested, and it can really fluctuate. So not worrying about that, but just keeping up the consistency, trusting the process, and going from there. I want to be bold, ambitious, and proactive when it comes to reaching out to people this year. I've got so many sort of dream guests, I suppose, and people who I think I genuinely can reach out to and start to get on the podcast. So I just need to, again, be proactive with that and really push for that. And in doing that, I need to not sell myself short. I think I've already done it at the start when I first started. Was I was probably underselling myself and not really having the confidence in myself to say, yeah, this is a good podcast and I want you to be on it. And this is why. And that's something that I need to work on. And I'm going to continue to work on going forward. So that's question one. Question two is from episode 28 with Craig Sadler. So his question was this: tell me something achievable and relative that would put you out of your comfort zone. So, unlike Craig, I'm not going to row across the Atlantic yet. But I think for me, in terms of a physical sense, I think after the year of triathlons this year, I think an Ironman is probably the next thing that I want to do. That would definitely be out my comfort zone. Um, I will probably be doing that in 2026. My partner and I want to do that together. We've spoken about that, but unfortunately, she's had some major shoulder surgery this year. So that's going to be healing a lot throughout this year. So we'll probably be looking at 2026 to do that together. But this year, I'm looking forward to just taking a step back from the triathlon for a bit, trying to get a bit more into the jiu-jitsu again, because I really enjoyed that. And just enjoying having a bit more fun with my fitness, not really having a overbearing event or something to train for, just enjoy whatever I feel like doing in the moment. But yeah, I think an Ironman is that thing that's going to take me out of my comfort zone next. So our next question comes from episode 29, and that was with Jeremy George. So his question was this: if you had 1 year left to live, what would you do? I think it's so hard to get into that mindset when you aren't in that position, but I'm going to try. And I'd like to hear what you guys think as well of your own, if you can get into that mindset. So for me, I think, again, it's sort of cliche, but I think it would be some form of traveling the world, spending times with loved ones, and maybe doing those two together, traveling with them. Um, just see as much as I can before that year's up, I suppose, because there's so much more out there, and traveling is something that I need to step up. So that's another reflection for the year. Maybe I'll try and travel some more next year. On to the next question, and that was from episode 30 with Kyle Smith. So Kyle's question was this: what are you saying should to that you could say can to. So that's the idea of, what do we say in life where, oh, I should do this or I should do that, when really you could actually say, I can do that or I can do this. Um, I think for me, it comes down to, again, that sort of prep stuff. So I keep saying to myself, oh, I should prep my week more. I should do some more meal planning. I should do all this. Well, I can do that. There's nothing stopping me. So I need to take that into 2025. And yeah, I think I can focus more on my meal planning. I think I can get all the little sort of jobs done that need doing. Those little things that aren't super urgent, but they're just in the back of your mind. As soon as you get them done, they're gone and they're done, and you can move on with a clear mind. So that's probably for me, is starting to do that a bit more. So the next question comes from episode 31, and that was from Jack Hallows. So Jack asked, if in the next 12 months you could begin one thing with no negative side effects, it's only going to work out positively, what would it be? So I think if you asked me that a year ago, obviously the question would be to start this podcast. And that's all I sort of want to do at the minute. So I'm going to sort of change the question, I suppose, because I would say all I want to do at the minute for the next 12 months is fully lean into the podcast and just see what happens. I want to start investing more in terms of my time into learning, into knowledge, and into equipment as well. Just continuously improving where I can, areas where I think it will improve the podcast, and yeah, taking feedback from you guys and listening to what's working, what's not. Again, I'm always happy to learn. So it's not really something to begin. I've spoken about a lot of actions that I want to begin, so I suppose I could use those as well. But yeah, also reaching out to guests. So I think I can probably reach out to a few more guests that I think might be just out of my reach, but you never know if they're going to say yes. And worst case, they just ignore me. So there's not actually really a negative to that. So I will try and reach out to some more interesting people, and see where that goes. Two more questions. So this one was from Dr. Susie Bennett, episode 34. And that episode has really opened up some interesting conversations outside of the episode. And it's been really rewarding to see the impact of that episode. Such a difficult topic to talk about for a lot of people, but it's a topic that we all know is very important. And to see that it's sort of changing people's perspectives and understanding of male suicide, that is really rewarding to me. So thank you if you listened to it. Thank you if you shared it with anyone who needed to hear it. So Susie's episode, her question was, who have been / are the great men in your life? Again, I'm going to sort of cop out on this one. I think there's a few people that come to mind who I've learned certain things from, but I think there's greatness in every man. I think greatness can be in certain areas and they might not be great at others. But I think if you can learn little pockets of greatness from different people and piece them together in yourself, then that's a beautiful way to learn, because I don't think there's any one person who has everything right. I don't think that's possible. We're human beings. So, in terms of a few that come to mind, like, again, his name's probably boring you, but Chris Williamson, I learned so much from his podcast. It's inspired me to do this one. Obviously, the name of this podcast, The Lonely Chapter, is one of his ideas. It's the idea that as you start to progress yourself in life, start to do new habits and form new ideas, you start to grow distant from your current set of friends, but you're not developed enough yet to be with the new set of friends at the other end of it. So you're in that lonely chapter in the middle. And that's something that really resonated with me, that idea. And so I used it, and I met him at a meet and greet a few weeks ago, and I did tell him the name of the podcast, and he was all happy with it. So we've got the green light to carry on. Um, but yeah, he's definitely had a big impact on me and how I think about the world. Um, I've been lucky as well. Like if I look back across my life of work, the managers I've had in my life, um, in all of my jobs have been fantastic. I've been very lucky that I've never had that moment where people talk about, oh, my manager or whatever it is. I've never really had that moment. And I've learned a lot over those years, especially the early years where it's your first sort of step into work life. And just being reminded that whilst, yes, there's certain ways you need to carry yourself, also never stop having fun. Like, remember to have fun with whatever you're doing. Like, that's something that all of my managers have instilled. And I think that's something that I want to carry on and instill in other people as well. Is that reminder that however serious your work is, never stop having fun. One last question, then, and that is from episode 35, the most recent episode with Craig Merriweather. So, Craig asked, what do you see me practicing every day? Or what do you think you practice every day? And that was in terms of practicing habits or behaviors that then lead to how you feel. So, whether you have high confidence, low confidence, whether you have anxiety or anger, or how you control that anger, etc. So, if I look at myself and what I try and practice, I try to practice thinking before reacting. So it's something that I've worked on over the last few years. And I've spoken before about sort of road rage and how that was something that I was quite bad at for a time. And nowadays in the car, I'm very mellow. And in life, I try not to react straight away. I try and take all of the information in, give myself a few seconds, because you can't take stuff back, but you can then react a few seconds late. Obviously, there's certain circumstances where you can't, but that's a different thing. Um, but yeah, in terms of driving, if you're driving along and someone upsets you or shouts something out their window, if you forget it and keep going about your day, you've forgotten about it within 10 seconds. I can guarantee you, it's gone. If you start reacting or shouting back or rolling down your own window, they are going to stay with you for the rest of that journey, maybe the rest of your day, and it it can really impact you. So it's not worth it. It's really not worth it for one moment of just breathe for 5 seconds, think it through. It's not worth it. On the flip side, though, you can overthink things as well. So I try not to overthink things. Um, it's about taking those few seconds to just think, is this the right answer? Is this the right action for me to take in line with my values? And then go with it. And whatever happens after that happens. You can't sit there and say, if I say this, then they're going to react like that. Then this could happen. Then that could happen. And before you know it, you've got this whole story of how things are going to go in your mind. For me personally, that doesn't work or give me any value. I think just check it's within your values and your beliefs and in your alignment, lay it out, and then whatever's going to happen, happen. So that wraps up the questions from my guests. And also, that wraps up the last episode of 2024. I just want to thank you one more time. So, anyone who's listened this year, anyone who's listening here for the first time, thank you so much for coming along. And I'm really excited to see what happens in 2025. Hopefully, you are too. I wish you and your families Happy New Year. And lastly, from me, if you haven't already followed the podcast or rated the podcast, wherever you're listening, if you could do that, that really helps me just reach new people, spread the word, and spread the information. That's what we're trying to do. Um, you can also follow me on Instagram at Lonely Chapter Podcast. And lastly, from me, see you in 2025. And thank you for listening.